Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today we are talking to Maya Gebeily, the Baghdad correspondent for Agence France Presse. Welcome to my office, actually.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Thank you.
This is actually our last podcast of 2019, and it is the first Middle East Brief that's done in person, so we have two sets of firsts here. So.
Distinct honor. Thanks.
Yeah. So when I heard that you were coming to town, or at least to Washington, you graciously accepted an invite to come up to Philadelphia, so thank you for that. And I think that you can obviously provide unique perspectives on what's happening in Baghdad in Iraq, because you spend most of your time there and you obviously cover it. So I think let's just start there for the listeners. Obviously, if you read the New York Times, there's been some protests. Maybe you can walk us through what it's like, what the protests are about, and maybe some of the key actors.
Sure. So at this point, we've had about 2 months of near consecutive protests, and they are playing out in different cities across the South and in Baghdad as well. But mostly, it's a story that everyone's read, which is people get really angry about corruption, people get really angry about lack of jobs. And for the first time in a really long time, those protests, that anger has been sustained into a weeks-long protest movement, into occupation of public squares, which is also something new for most Iraqi cities. It's been met with different kinds of violence at different points. Different kinds of security forces getting involved to protect specific interests, and we can talk about those and why they're protecting their interests in certain ways. At this point, we have anywhere between 460 and 510 dead. It's a shocking number, and it's one that sadly people don't react so strongly to because there's a history of violence in Iraq that people are used to reading about, people are used to seeing. So that number doesn't register as so shocking, but Iraqi society is very much traumatized by what's happened over the past 2 months. And we talked about what might happen next. It's really hard to predict where this is going to go because for so many reasons it is unprecedented. The size of the protest movement, the fact that it sustained itself for week after week after week, despite the violence, and the number of dead are all firsts also for Iraq. And you see the political class shifting and adapting to this new kind of threat. The political class, who I'm referring to, are kind of the key main actors that have been around for the past 16 years. But also you have especially the political representations of the Hashd al-Shabi, who for the first time since the elections last year are an entrenched part of the political elite. Part of the anger from the street is this expectation that these groups that very valiantly retook their cities from ISIS and are heroes in so many of the Iraqi people's eyes were not able to overcome that entrenched corruption, that nepotism, the elitism, that they thought that these groups would be able to resist, combat, etc. So that disappointment was a huge reason that there was sustained anger in the street. And so you're seeing those political actors collectively decide that we need to protect our gains politically and financially, and that's led to a lot of the violence that we've seen.
Yeah, I think maybe we should also step back a little bit, because I think it's important to put this into context about the change in Iraqi government. So the last election, which I actually can't remember offhand when it was,
May 2018.
May 2018, it came on the heels of a successful campaign against Islamic State. We were joking off the podcast about, Baghdad was boring because it was sort of peaceful and calm.
Yep.
And maybe let's start there. So maybe talk about the political changes that came after the May 2018 elections. Sort of who emerged out of that political struggle, and then how that then began to feed into these protests. And because I know you mentioned the Hashd, the popular mobilization forces, the Shia militias for shorthand. There's different types and classes. We can maybe get into it a little bit, but maybe just spell that for a little bit there, beginning in May.
Yeah, and Iraqis themselves very clearly link the political crisis they're living now to those elections as well, because the main political divisions that you could see play out in parliament and even in the cabinet and kind of across the government had to do with the fact that there was no clear majority, no clear coalition as a result of those elections. So I showed up in Baghdad actually in November. So I came about 6 months after the elections, and I remember kind of, as I was preparing to take up this new post from Beirut, I was reading, the daily product, what was coming out of the bureau every day, so I could make sure to be very well prepared and understand what was happening politically. And I was getting dizzy kind of reading, because every day the parties would align themselves in different formations.
Right.
And that has carried on basically for the past year and a half. So people will all of a sudden step back and consider themselves part of the opposition, or they'll align themselves with a different party. And the fact that the ground is always moving has made it very, very difficult for the country to have any kind of progress, any kind of political progress, economic progress, financial progress. So what happened in those elections is you had Muqtada Sadr get his parliamentary bloc get the largest share, plurality basically, of the seats in parliament. They aligned with the political arm of the Hashd al-Shabi, the Fatah bloc, and they decided, as the two largest blocs, essentially, the two largest groupings, if you'd like, they decided that they would endorse and back Adel Abdel Mahdi as the prime minister. So he had the endorsement of these two blocs. There wasn't much that was known about him before he became prime minister. He has a history of kind of jumping from different political parties.
It's geriatric.
He's not young. But he was the first non-Dawa PM. Many people really had hung a lot of their hopes about this kind of new direction that Iraq could take on the fact that there was this political independent that was at the helm. They were really excited by what that could mean. As you mentioned, ISIS had been announced, defeated across the country. Everybody kind of felt like this was a new chapter, a well-deserved new chapter for Iraq that had been living these decades of back-to-back-to-back conflict, and finally we can move on, right?
And Sadr has a kind of a checkered political history, maybe violent history. But if I'm remembering correctly, one of his platforms was he was a man of the people, and that he would be less opulent than perhaps some of the Iraqi political classes. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not a total expert on Iraqi politics.
That's the perception, right? He's always been somebody that defines himself as a populist, and he has influence in the street amongst his own supporters, but it's been very hard for him to expand that into broad popular support, kind of across Iraqi cities and across age groups and across other demographics. But in his own kind of really, really hardcore base, he's untouchable. And that the election last year put him in this really interesting position where he's always been a self-declared populist, but now he actually has a really large share of the parliament. He has to contend with political. He's a political stake in the government. So when he came out when the protest started and called on the government to resign, everyone kind of looked around and thought, "But you're the one of the main sponsors of this government. How does that work?" But that's him, right? He's got one foot in Iran, one foot in Saudi, one foot in Iraq. He's always moving back and forth. He's hedging his bets constantly. And you'll never see him kind of dedicate himself fully to a single political position. He leaves himself an exit strategy in every scenario. And that's why it's really hard to predict where he's going to go and where he ends up and whether he's gained or lost from these protests. But as one of the main sponsors of the government, he had aligned himself with people that he'd been rivals with for a very, very long time. So many of the guys in the Hashd were his former allies who had left the Mahdi army, people that he had become kind of frenemies with. So that was a very tenuous relationship from the get-go. And they were those two blocs were jockeying for key political kind of appointments. So not just the ministers, not just who would become minister in this new government that was being born in 2018, but even below ministers, the really influential jobs of director generals in the ministries, people who have to sign a lot of paperwork. These are the positions that have a lot of influence in the massive Iraqi state infrastructure. So that competition was ongoing constantly, for months. Those tensions were, had a lot of ups and downs. And when it really hit a head in October, it was for several reasons, but if you kind of zoom out and look at what was happening in Iraq, you've got a growing population. this is a story we've heard across the region. It's not particularly unique to Iraq itself, but you have a population that continues to grow. The state is the biggest employer by far, but they're not able to create jobs fast enough to employ all these people. Most of the unemployed youth they understand that there's a pay-to-play system. They can't afford to play or to pay. So they're locked out of it. And so that frustration gave birth to this protest movement. So you talk to protesters in the street, they understand very, very clearly what is happening politically. They understand exactly how entrenched those parties are. They're disappointed by some of the players they expected more from, but they know exactly how the system works. And I think part of the reason that it's been, you see both sides digging in their heels is because the political elite doesn't really understand the people, and they don't understand why they're so angry, and they don't understand why they don't believe in the system.
Well, most of them have spent a lot of time in exile, and most of them spend a lot of time behind blast walls, right?
Exactly, and they're going back to those same strategies. A lot of them kind of were not around, or made a point not to be around in Baghdad when things got really violent, and obviously they've set up barricades and set up security forces specifically around the Green Zone, around government offices, and that's where you see the most violence. That's where you see protesters, in the dozens lose their lives in a single day, because there's a very kind of visceral response to any perceived threat to the state itself, and that's met with a very, very heavy hand, whether it's the oil ministry, whether it's near parliament, etc. That's where you see most of the violence. But I think it's really important to notice, to make a point also, that what plays out in Baghdad is so different than what plays out in the south, and each city in the south has a really different history, different power dynamics. The involvement of the tribes is different, the involvement of the local politicians. So Baghdad is very much, it's the epicenter of the movement.
It's almost in the center of the country. It's close.
It's close. And it's where the political elite are willing to defend, their statures and their positions much more violently. But that doesn't mean that what's happening in the rest of the country isn't extremely important for those individual power centers, for Nasiriyah, for Basra, for Diwaniyah, etc. Nasiriyah is a great example. It's where Adel Abdel Mahdi was born. And the violence that played out there over the course of a couple of days in late November is what led to his resignation eventually, because it was unforgivable in many of the political elite's eyes. So yeah, very different dynamics across the country.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is when you play this out is that particularly here, so on the East Coast, we're not in Washington, but we're close, is that people try and ascribe motivations to the protesters. And the country that floated around a lot is Iran. So what's the Iranian presence within these protest movements? Are some of the political elites, shuttling back and forth to Tehran, or is, elements of the Iranian government shuttling back and forth between Tehran and Baghdad? And then does this represent sort of the peak of Iranian power in the region? I'm always very, very hesitant to ascribe sort of like grandiose strategy to any country. I think most countries kind of figure it out as they go along. Some are better at it than others. And two, I always tend to discount some sort of like hidden hand that pulls the strings of these people on the streets. My guess is a lot of these people are just angry, as you said, about political and economic inadequacies in their own country. And I'm curious what you think about that, first. And second of all, there are lots of reports on social media, as you mentioned, that the violence are being carried out by non-uniform members so people not in uniforms. So whether they be the Iraqi Federal Police, just regular police, or elements of the military. So just unpack that sort of incoherent statement I just made. And
where does Iran fit into either one?
And where does Iran fit into there?
Sure.
People are suggesting that the Iranians are behind these sort of mass killings, if you will.
The response, sure. So to step back and talk about Iran's role in the anger that the protesters have, I had the same skepticism, right? So I was worried that editors and analysts and others sitting in DC, and not in Philly, but only in DC, would start to make this about Iran. And also because part of the US government's response to these protests were like, this must be...
We'll get there next.
Exactly. So we're thrilled that this is, people are shedding Iranian influence. So I was skeptical about also ascribing a role to Iran, or kind of shoehorning Iran into these protests. But people are actually angry about it.
Yeah.
And the reason that is because it does have a very real impact on their daily lives. When you're in the South and you don't see very many Iraqi products in the markets because Iranian products, whether it's yogurt or imported fruit or cars or carburants or whatever it is, those are cheaper and they flood the market. That's a visceral, physical presence that many Iraqis started to feel was overwhelming. When you add on top of that kind of the next layer, which is the perceived overreach that Iran has politically in Iraq, so on top of that kind of economic impact, this feeling that, okay, well, there's Iranian officials that are always here, or there's Iranian influence in Baghdad that we didn't really sign up for. People were in the streets with pictures of Qasem Soleimani, smacking their shoes on his face. I've never seen that. I've never heard of that happening. So there was a really, really strong reaction to perceived economic and political influence that Iran has. When the protests started to be repressed, when they were met with violence, and people started to blame, in the streets, people started to blame Iranian-backed paramilitary groups, that really escalated the fury that people had towards Iran. So then it became kind of a very, very sharp and targeted criticism that not only is Iran, not only does it have economic overreach and political overreach, but now they're trying to protect their center of power in Baghdad with that level of violence. So people started to really have a role and a place in their anger. And on the flip side, it has been really difficult and almost impossible for us to confirm any specific Iranian role in the physical repression of the protests. That's not something that we've been able to confirm at AFP. It's something that we hear constantly in the discussions that we have with protesters. But what we have seen is we've seen unknown elements, as you said, take part in the response to the rallies. We've heard from security sources that there are people that are present among their units that they don't know, that they don't speak to, that they have never seen before, who show up in unmarked vehicles with uniforms that they didn't recognize, all black, etc. Oftentimes wearing masks, don't identify themselves, etc. So what is clear is that there is some kind of breach in the security response, that it's not a state-led or state-dominated response to the rallies, but I can't give you, that's a big question mark. I don't know what the answer to that question is. But politically, it's quite clear. Politically, we've seen Qasem Soleimani multiple times visit Baghdad, visit Najaf, and other cities in Iraq, and take part in consultations and meetings with people. That's been called out, obviously, by the U.S. government multiple times, and many protesters in the streets, see that, and that just validates their anger. But when you talk to Iraqi officials about what that means, they're like, it's a done deal. The facts on the ground are that we have to deal with our neighbor who has decades of influence in Iraq, and it's natural that they would be here to have these consultations. There's varying levels of reports about what kind of meetings are actually taking place, whether they are directive meetings, as in Iranian officials telling Iraqis what to do, or whether it's the same kind of meeting that would happen if a State Department official were to show up in Iraq and do consultations and questions and answers about what's happening politically. But as far as the protesters are concerned, it's another example of overreach.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to put it. And one of the things is you also have a U.S. government that has a very large role in what the current Iraqi government looks like,
Sure.
If not a dominant role in terms of the structure, maybe in terms of influence on day-to-day happenings. And then you also have a layer on top of that, which is the Trump administration's maximum pressure strategy, which is designed to essentially undo elements of the Obama administration sanctions relief in return for compliance with benchmarks for a nuclear agreement. Mm-hmm. With the unstated aim of trying to economically weaken the Iranian government to the point where the people rise up and topple them themselves. So there are some people, that's what I was trying to get at, that in the U.S. see this as a success of maximum pressure, excuse me.
See the protests in Iraq as a success?
As a sort of symptomatic, in that there's protests in Iran, there's protests in Lebanon, but there's also these protests in Iraq. So these nodes of Iranian power are in turmoil. How would you judge how the U.S. is handling this, for like on the ground? The embassy, obviously, I think is the largest U.S. embassy in the world. Yeah. But it's also
before the order of withdrawal. Yeah.
Before the withdrawal, there's a lot of blast walls there too. Just give us a sense of how the Americans are handling this.
Okay, I can give you a sense of how Iraqi officials talk about the Americans handling it. And
in some way, that's more valuable.
More than what I think. Yeah, absolutely. So Iraqi officials and even some U.S. officials who are on the ground will say that there is an absence of a U.S. role, or there is a very, very minimal U.S. role in the discussions that are happening around the protests. Nobody says that nobody is surprised by that. So they see it as the natural kind of minimalizing of that role over the course of years for various reasons. One of them is you have the lowest troop levels in Iraq in years. So immediately when you don't have that military footprint, there's no political footprint that comes along with it. A lot of them point to the fact that there has been, not just under Trump, but under Obama, a deprioritizing of Iraq. So let's say under Bush, he handled the file personally. Then under Obama, you kind of kicked it to Kerry, and now it's Pompeo basically that is has it as one of his many priorities. So as it gets pushed further down the list of priorities, you've got fewer trips, and you've got fewer diplomats that are there, and
to the point where I think when Trump visited, he didn't actually go to Baghdad, and I think on Pompeo's last trip, he also didn't go to Baghdad.
Neither Trump nor Pence actually visited Baghdad, which is extremely insulting to a lot of Iraqi officials.
I think the last one was about security, but the first one, I think it was because the president just didn't want to go to Baghdad, whether for personal comfort or fear.
Yeah. That was around Christmas last year.
That was around Christmas last year. Mm-hmm. He went and visited the troops as part of ISIS. On the last trip, I mean, I honestly, when I saw that, it was Pence, right? It was Pence and Pompeo? Pence. I thought they just didn't want to, the Secret Service wouldn't let him go in there.
What was really surprising and made a lot of Iraqi officials angry as well is that fine, they'd seen Trump come in last year. He didn't come to Baghdad. The prime minister refused to come out to meet him at Ain al-Assad. As far as diplomatic protocol, they should be meeting in the capital, not at a military base. Fine. So what really angered Iraqi officials this time around with Pence is that he visited Erbil.
Yes, because Erbil's safe.
Because Erbil is safe. He can visit the president of the Kurdish region. He can, have photo ops with him, but he can't come to Baghdad and meet our prime minister, our president. That was a point of, that was, again, another break in that relationship. I mean, Iraqi and U.S. officials had, there was a lot of personal relationships from 2003 onwards, right? The U.S. basically had to rebuild, dismantled.
We're still doing it.
Yeah, from the ground up. They rebuilt the ministries. They had a lot of really close consultations. And I don't want to say that they handpicked ministers, but maybe just short of that. U.S. and Iraqi officials have both described to me that this is the coldest relationships have been in years. There's no personal ties. There's very little interaction. The U.S. diplomatic footprint there is the smallest. It's been a very long time, and there's a small group of people that hold meetings, but otherwise they're very, very, very much hands off. What U.S. officials will say is that at this particular time, when protests are raging, that's an intentional decision that we're making because we don't want to be perceived as as involved in the protest movement, as backing it. We don't want to give the impression to conspiracy theorists that we're involved in any way. But Iraqis say, where are you guys? We've had this close relationship with you for years. You know us. Why are we not seeing you in meetings, and why are we not engaging with you on that level? So it's not a shock to anybody. They see it as kind of the latest stage in this trajectory over the past couple of years. And which they date back to Obama, not to Trump. No one kind of says that this is a Trump era. They say that the chaos that we're seeing from the White House currently is something that we hadn't experienced before, but the deprioritizing of Iraq started way before this current administration.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say over here people would link it to the withdrawal, but I would say maybe a better way to think about it is that the withdrawal was the end of this being on the president's desk every day. That's a really good way to put it. And then it gets pushed down to our ministers or secretaries and all that. And then perhaps with the end of the ISIS campaign, sort of the large-scale, overt ISIS campaign with large amounts of ground forces, that footprint decreased even further. So let's wrap up here, but where is this going, right? So like,
I'm laughing because I used to ask you this, and I want to put it back to you.
The answer is I don't know. I mean, we have.
Yeah.
I keep meaning to do an episode on protests in Lebanon, but I just, for scheduling, it just hasn't happened yet. But like, it's the same question. It's like, where do these protests go? What does this mean for the Iranians? What does this mean for the U.S.? More importantly, what does this mean for the Iraqis? I think anybody who's been to Iraq, and as I told you, I've only been to the north. I'm that typical American, not official, but I go to the Kurdish region. The country has a lot of problems, obviously, but like, is this the start of a new day, or is this more or less the same? I just don't know how else to phrase the question.
It's neither. I mean, not to kind of give you that cliche and leave myself an out, but it is neither. It's there's no way that it's going to create the kind of sea change that people in the street want to see. And I think many protesters now, those young guys who are there and who haven't left Tahrir Square for 45 straight days or whatever, they know that they're not going to bring down the regime, capital R. But I don't want to discount what they have done. What they have done is create a physical space where they can talk and they can criticize in ways that they had never done before. They have imposed themselves on the political decision-making process. So on December 1st, the Prime Minister, Al Abdel-Mahdi, submitted his resignation to Parliament, which also was a first for Iraq. We've never had a Prime Minister resign post-2003. That's huge. And that was a victory for protesters, and yet, having seen what's played out in the region around them, they know that that's not enough, and so they didn't clear the streets after that. He had to bend to public street pressure and to the result of that pressure on political parties that then had to pressure him, and on the religious establishment that then had to pressure him to resign. So we're seeing street protests impose themselves, genuine street protests impose themselves on political decision making in ways we hadn't seen before. And now at a time where they have to decide on a new prime minister and consultations are happening and there's supposed to be a name that, the deadline is in the next 48 hours.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. They're for the first time, the political elite say we have to pick somebody who will be accepted by the street. When have they ever cared about that? It's only ever been a consensus candidate that needs to be agreed upon by the different parties, by Iran, by the U.S., by the Marja'iyya. Okay, you work your way down the checklist and they all have to approve, but it's never been somebody that the street has to care about. And for the first time, they actually, they're
think tanks are on that list too, because we read an op-ed about that.
At the very bottom.
At the very bottom.
Yeah, you're there.
We're the last step. Yeah. How Iran's winning.
Oh, God. No, we can discuss that too. Is it a win? Is it a loss, etc. But it's what can I say? The Iraqi political scene has been changed forever by these protests. I don't think we're ready to say that, but there's discussions that happen in the street. There's discussions that happen in the halls of power in Baghdad that weren't happening before. That's a victory that people in the street can celebrate. But there's a lot of potential losses too.
Right.
Will the security infrastructure be compromised in ways that are irreparable? Will Iran have consolidated its influence among its main allies, also in ways that are even kind of more hearted and more cemented than before? Will the U.S. find itself without a role at all in the next 3 to 4 years in Iraq? These are all, I think, things that will become clear in the next, I would say, 4 to 6 months. But what's clear also is that people, government has adapted to having people in the street. So there is a new reality that has been created in the public space there. And it's anybody's guess, I think.
Can I ask you one last question?
Of course,
and then we'll wrap up. Where does Sutter go from here? Because he's such an interesting character. Like, I mean, you mentioned him at the top of the podcast. He runs his own militia, or at least he used to. The militia was involved a lot.
The Peace Brigades.
Peace Brigades. They've run a lot of nefarious activity during the U.S. occupation. He had positioned himself during the counter-ISIS campaign, one of the things that the U.S. was trying to do was to, as part of the effort to isolate the Iranians, or at least try and box out the Iranians, was to have rapprochement between Riyadh and Baghdad. And I think Sadr at one point showed up in Riyadh. I think
he did.
I think Brent McGurk, much vilified in certain circles, was involved in this as well as trying to. But at the same time, as you mentioned earlier, so he's like the ultimate political animal with the militia, and he's obviously, I think his bloc won the most votes in the parliament, or at least the most seats. Where is he going? I mean, where does he do now? I mean,
I think it's a tough call, and it's tough to kind of imagine what's going on inside of his head. But he always drew strength from the street. That's kind of the cliche that everyone describes.
Right. But it was his street.
It was his street. He was the only force before these protests. He was the only one that could actually bring out tens of thousands of people into the public space in ways that would threaten the powers that be. So he had that. I think he was really proud of having that distinction before these protests started. I think what he thought when they started was that he'd be able to leverage that power and ride the wave, co-opt the protests, whatever kind of phrase you want to use. And actually what he found was the opposite, is that people were able to sustain themselves and their presence in the street without him calling in for more support. And he found that his political influence in parliament itself was not enough to bring down the government in the initial phases when he was really calling for the resignation. I think the tides have turned for Sadr like 6 or 7 times since the protest started, because there's every kind of week we'll try to do an assessment of like where does he stand now, and it keeps changing. I think what he was able to do is he was able to position himself and Saraya Salam, the peace brigades, which is the new
Army,
the new name for the Mahdi army. He was able to position them as the de facto protectors of the protesters.
That's funny.
So they're in the street in Tahrir Square. They're in the street in other cities as well, running logistics, making sure patting down protesters that want to come, anybody that wants to come into the square, providing security, doing a lot of the supplying of blankets, food, water, electricity, whatever it might be. Well, a lot of them have Molotov cocktails and small knives. But are they carrying firearms? No. So that's put him in a direct confrontation with a lot of the paramilitary forces that want to see these protests end.
Right.
So that's deepened the rift between those two as well. Yeah, which we saw kind of happen in peak of that conflict basically last week on the 6th, when there was an attack on this protest encampment, Baghdad, and you saw paramilitary forces enter this building where protesters had been camped out for weeks, and you saw members of Saraya Salam come in to try to either, depending on who you talk to, defuse the security fighters that came in, etc. So that confrontation has become much, much more violent, and we've been anticipating some kind of potential, some kind of infighting, basically, between different armed groups in Iraq, building off of the protests. So it wouldn't be protester faction, it would be basically the different factions that are trying to, they've got old scores to settle.
Yeah.
Basically.
That's interesting. Yeah, because because the last thing too is that within that there's been moves within the Iraqi security forces about who's in charge of different ministries and the PMF. That's good stuff. Maya, we could continue, but we're going to wrap it up here for the listeners, because this is eating into our lunchtime. So with that, thank you for coming to Philadelphia.
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you for coming.
It's cold, but I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. It's cold and rainy. East Coast of the United States. I'm from California. It's not a good place to be. And with that, thank you for coming, and thank you everybody for listening.